My name is Sean Wiswesser, formerly a 28-year intelligence professional of the U.S. intelligence community, with the vast majority of that time as a CIA operations officer or case officer. So there are commonalities among intelligence services, if they're worldwide services, as the Russians are, as CIA is, as MI6, SIS in the UK is a worldwide service, very professional services. There are certainly commonalities in agent operations, how we conduct espionage, how we handle agents. Again, one of the phrases we use in CIA is sticks and bricks for how we run agents with impersonal communications. And that's universal to a lot of intelligence services. And then there's other aspects of intelligence work that are very unique to the Russians in particular. The Russians believe very much in using the stick versus the carrot. Russians believe in what they call compromising material operations. Back before the KGB, even back to the days of the Bolshevik Revolution, they've always believed in intimidation and terror. Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the CHK, the first committee for the defense of the revolution, he was famous for saying that we stand for organized terror. And Lenin very much believed in it, so did Stalin, Trotsky, all of the early revolutionaries. So the first Soviet intelligence services, the CHK, and then the OGPU, the NKVD, the MGB, all that led on later on to the KGB and its successor agencies now, they believe in the stick, they believe in terror, they believe in intimidation. So that is practiced both domestically and it bleeds into their foreign intelligence work as well. So the Russians tend to want to use compromising material information in their operations. What I mean is sexpionage, using what the Russians call swallows or lastочки in order to entrap targets. They'll use gambling. They'll use businesses in Russia. You're trying to do business in Russia, they'll extort you. Either you work with us, and they do that a lot with organized crime. You either help us, you pay to organized crime, or you help the FSB, or you do both, or your business is going to be run out of Russia, or you're thrown in jail and you're arrested on some trumped up charge. So they believe very firmly in that type of compromising operations, coercion. Some people say, oh, well, what, CIA has never done that? We don't believe in it because we don't think it works fundamentally. Our service believes that that an agent, assets or agents are those that work for us. Remember, I was an intelligence officer, I was a case officer. So we believe that agents or assets will only work for you under coercion as long as they have to in order to get out from under whatever pressure you're applying to them. So we believe in incentivizing with benefits and more the carrot versus the stick. So let's talk about an example of Russian coercive intelligence espionage operations. The Russians love to use honey traps. They call them compromising material operations. The material part changes. It can be sex, it can be gambling, whatever the vulnerability of their target. Whether the target is an American intelligence officer or a British diplomat, somebody like, of course, you had the famous Parfumo affair here in the UK, where, you know, very important politician in the UK was sleeping with a prostitute who was sharing favors with, I believe it was a GRU resident at the time. The Russians are very good at this. They're very well practiced at it. They've been doing it 100 years. And so they'll use honey traps of whatever variety. It doesn't matter to them if the target is heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual. They're going to find the target, they're going to find the target's interest, and then they're going to present that particular lure, if you will, that bait to the target. So why is it effective? Why does it still work? You know, we've done a lot of awareness in the United States within our government. We've done a lot of training. We inundate our personnel with the awareness that the Russians, and the Chinese for that matter, they use this tactic, and they use it a lot. The Lonetree case, he was a Marine Guard in Moscow in the mid-'80s, and he was seduced by a young KGB operative. She wasn't an intelligence officer, she was just what we would call a co-optee. She was coerced by the KGB too. She was told, hey, you're going to work with us. She had a job as a secretary in the US Embassy. We had a lot of Russian citizens, Soviet citizens working in our embassy. Until recently, they still did. And so she saw this vulnerable, kind of naive loner. He wasn't very well liked even by the other Marines, Lonetree. And she seduced him. She preyed on his emotional vulnerability so that it wasn't just about sex. And when Lonetree left the Soviet Union, he was posted, I believe, in Austria, she continued contact with him. And she had introduced by that point her uncle Sasha. Well, Uncle Sasha was the KGB officer. And so this is the approach. They have a not just sex, but an emotional vulnerability makes it even more important to the relationship. And then they introduce the intelligence officer, either by virtue of coercion, saying, kind of like they did at Lonetree, hey, I'm going to get in trouble now as a Soviet citizen. Her name was Violetta. Clayton, I love you so much, but I'm going to get in trouble now because we've had this relationship. And my Uncle Sasha said he's willing to help us. That's the approach. And the reason they keep using it, all of the Russian services, is it still works. It works against businessmen, and not just in Russia. In the stands, I won't name specific countries, but a lot of those that end with Stan, I'm familiar with that part of the world. I'm familiar with their techniques. They do this very actively. In fact, at one point in my career, had some interactions with one particular service, and I was tasked with telling them, hey, quit offering your prostitutes to US government officials that come in your blinking country. We're tired of it. We know what you're doing. So they do it a lot. They're always trying to, and they were shocked. What are you talking about, Sean? Hey, we know you're doing it. Here's an example. 5 different times in the past month. At bars, at this hotel, we're constantly being approached. We know what you're doing. Knock it the hell off. So it's not just the Russians, it's I call them sister slave services of the former Soviet Union on the eastern side in particular. A lot of the countries run by dictatorships. They won't like me calling them out, but I'm calling them out. They're closely aligned with the Russians. They do this. They work with the Russian services on it. So it is a technique they use, not just in Russia, they use it abroad. And some of those other countries are closely aligned with. The Chinese do the same thing. But that's the idea. Get a mental connection and then exploit that connection. They do it because it works. It still results in them recruiting sources. So the question comes up, well, doesn't CIA do the same thing? No. It's not that we've never done those things in the history of my agency. We just don't believe fundamentally coercion works as a good technique. Espionage technique. Why? Because that target is always going to hate and resent what they did and what the intelligence service forced them to do. The Russians and their slave sister and slave brother services of the icky stands that cooperate and help them quite a bit from those parts of the former Soviet Union that still ally themselves with the Russians. By the way, they're helping the Russians with sanctions avoidance. I'm talking about Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. These are major problems. They're helping the Russians get away with the Ukraine war. And meanwhile, they're being very duplicitous, saying, no, we want to be closer integrated with the EU and the West. Nonsense. Then act like it. The Kazakhstani intelligence service is called the KNB. They didn't even change their name much from the KGB. So they do it. They assist the Russians. They believe in using the stick approach. In the West, we think that it's just not effective because when you coerce a target, what did Lonetree do? He turned himself in. Clayton Lonetree, to his great credit, he knew he'd done a horrible thing. He was betraying his oath as a Marine, betraying his country. He turned himself in. He did his prison sentence and he's been released, and now he's living quietly somewhere in the US. I mentioned in the book I knew a CIA officer who had met him after he turned himself in and saw a devastated human being with profound remorse. So he knew he was in trouble. He turned himself in. So they believe that they can coerce human beings. We fundamentally believe it's not a good technique. We would rather use benefits approach. We'd rather focus on what we can do to help. I always believed my entire career working with Russian intelligence officers and other targets, I was never asking them to make things worse for themselves or their family. I wasn't. They'll also play on ego with spies. In the spy business, we often talk about mice. Money, ideology, compromise, which is those operations I talked about before, sexpionage, compromat, the Russians love to use that. And then there's ego. Traditionally, the Russians have used financial motivations, money, and they'll use ego. They play on ego. So in the case of both Robert Hanssen, who betrayed the FBI, and Rick Ames, who unfortunately betrayed my own agency in 1994, he was caught, arrested. He just died in prison recently. They both did it for money, and they made millions of dollars doing it. So the Russians penetrate governments in the West. They work very hard to penetrate governments in NATO, the UK, the United States, and they pay very well for it. We're their number one target, the United States. I still believe that today, but number 2, 3, and 4 are all of our NATO allies. A Russian intelligence officer told me early in my career, he said to me, I was asking about global war on terror, and can't we all work together now? What are you seeing within your system? Again, this is a Russian helping us, betraying his country as a penetration of the Russian government. He said, make no mistake, you were the main enemy during the Cold War, you are the main enemy now, you always will be the main enemy of the Russian Federation and our intelligence services. You come number 1. For us, the United States comes first. NATO comes second, the UK, France, Germany, all of you right after that. So we're in their crosshairs. We would be fools to think they're not actively penetrating your government here in the UK right now, our government in the United States, and other NATO countries. They spend too much time and effort on it. They get all the resources they need to do it. There's one other aspect I should address when we're talking about Russian espionage penetrations of government. There's been a lot of talk recently in Europe about supposedly disposable agents. The Russians are making use of teenagers they recruit via Telegram or other apps. They'll pay them a few $1,000s to go take pictures of a rail line and then try to blow that rail line up in Poland. This is a formidable new threat, but it doesn't replace the fact I've seen very smart writers, journalists that are somewhat versed in intelligence but don't really understand the Russians. There's a lot of people writing and saying things now like, the Russians don't use Tradecraft anymore. I've had people counter me, oh, your books are irrelevant, it's not how they do it anymore. Let's not underestimate our adversaries for who they are. They know very well how to handle penetrations of governments, and they will use impersonal communications. They're going to use dead drops, packages they put down in the woods. They're going to use signals. They're going to totally avoid any digital footprint when they run penetrations of the UK government or the United States. It's what they've always done. This is what they teach at their academies. They don't teach it as well as they used to, but they're still teaching it. The Russians are not fools. When it comes to running the very best penetrations of governments in the West, they know how to do it securely. They've been doing it for decades. Those other types of agents they're recruiting now, I do believe they're making use maybe of one-time, they'll recruit one-time agents. I don't know if it's the right term. We're struggling to define this because they'll recruit a vulnerable teenager. They're recruiting a lot of Ukrainians that emigrated from Ukraine because of the war. But not only, they're recruiting Poles, Lithuanians, Estonians, Germans, French, all across Europe. They're trying to take advantage of teenagers, young people. Maybe they're drug addicts, maybe they're just upset at society. And so they've been doing this. They find them on Telegram or other apps and they're paying them cheap money. And then if they don't know what they're getting into, the target, the teenager or otherwise, the young person, after they've taken pictures of a rail line, the Russians will say, we want you to put a device down. And then the teenager may say, no, I'm not going to do that. And then they reveal, hey, you're not working for an organized crime group. You're working for the FSB. If you don't do this, we'll kill you. 2, if you don't do this, we'll turn you in to the German police or the Polish police. Well, now they're entrapped. It's classic coercion that the Russian intelligence services love to use. So that is happening right now, but we shouldn't mistake that for traditional espionage operations that the Russians still do very well when they need to. In the days of the KGB, the one begrudging compliment I give, and I give some other begrudging compliments in the book. I don't like to, but I want it to be fair and accurate. In the days of the KGB, they had professional intelligence training academies, both the KGB and the military service, the GRU. Yuri Drozdov was a famous head of Directorate S in the KGB, which was in charge of the illegals program, the Nelegali. It used to take 7 to 8 years to properly train an illegal officer of the KGB or the GRU for that matter, but Drozdov worked in the KGB. He'd say it took 8 years. We had to teach them language, culture, how to embed themselves in the West so that they wouldn't be suspected of even being a foreigner, to live in the UK completely undetected, unbeknownst to the security services, or in the United States. How to use dead doubles, one of their pieces of tradecraft. They often infiltrated via Canada. They'd pick up the identity of a baby that died in their infancy. They get a double extra birth certificate. They apply to it with some rudimentary documentation. Well, once you have a birth certificate, now you can get a passport, you can get everything else. So that's one of the techniques that they would use. All of this took time to train them. In the period of the 1930s and 40s, when the KGB had great success with illegals, those are known in nomenclature in the West as the great illegals, historically, because they were successful. Some of those illegals helped to penetrate the atom bomb project, the Manhattan Project in the United States. Rudolf Abel, the hollow nickel case, he was an illegal from the KGB sent to pick up the remnants of the atom bomb ring in the United States. He was eventually given up by another KGB illegal and he was found arrested and swapped at Kleinica Bridge. And the famous Bridge of Spies movies is based on Rudolf Abel. Well, they were the great illegals though. They were trained really well, they were good at their mission, they were subtle, they were humble, they were quiet, carrying out espionage. Now you look at today, by contrast, these are the not so great illegals. People like Anna Chapman, who became famous for all of her incompetence, ineptitude, and bungling. She's not even trying to hide her Russian heritage. She's what's called a special agent illegal in the SVR. It's their term. It's essentially a lower version, less trained, less capable, but they thought still competent enough to carry out espionage. Just because her daddy was a KGB officer, she ended up being a special agent illegal. Anna Chapman was given a MacBook with a special type of espionage gear. It's called Covert Communications. The Russians call it spetsvaz, so special connections. The system was called Bouquet, appropriately enough, Bouquet in Russian. So Anna Chapman's given this Bouquet system of a laptop. This is so that she doesn't have to meet Russian intelligence officers that are working at the embassy, for instance, so-called Line N officers that would be handling and working with the illegals. Line N for nelegal in Russian. So this enables the MacBook, the idea of it, and remember this is almost 20 years ago. Anna has been told you can do encrypted exchanges now, just like we do text messages today, essentially setting up their own Wi-Fi network between two of these laptops at a short distance of, think, 100 yards. But Anna was too incompetent to run the system properly. She was given a 26-character password and told to memorize it. But that was too much for Anna. So she wrote it down, kept the password in her purse at all times. So the FBI, very cleverly, before she was arrested and the other illegals were arrested, they wanted to be able to break into this system. So they had an FBI agent. He met with Anna in a cafe and posed as a Russian intelligence officer from the center. Anna was none the wiser just because he happened to be a native Russian speaker, or near native. So the FBI again has video of them in a cafe, and Anna's asking sort of questions, trying to establish in her mind, is he who he says he is, from the SVR center. Once she satisfies that, he says, hey, are you having problems with your laptop? She says, I am, as a matter of fact. Here it is. Can you take it back to the center for me? Which is also a big Tradecraft mistake. You never met this person before. So you think he works with the center, but you're not sure that. So she gives him the laptop. And then the FBI agent, being very savvy, he knows he needs the password. So he says, hey, by the way, do you have the parole in Russian? Do you have the password? Oh, I got it right here in my purse. So she takes out the password and gives it to him. So FBI is like, yes. Not only do we have the encrypted covert communication system, we have the password, because it's very good encryption. Russians know how to do encryption. So Anna gives it up. Now here's the really interesting part of the story. Anna leaves the meeting, starts having second thoughts. Geez, that was kind of strange. He did seem a little bit strange to me. So what does she do? She calls up Papa on her cell phone to Moscow. Hey, Papa, and he's a KGB officer. Hey, Papa, here's what happened. I just wanted to get your opinion on it. Well, Papa was wiser than Anna, better trained KGB officer. He knows she's in big trouble. And he tells her, listen, you're in big trouble. So Anna and Papa come up with a plan, which is a really stupid plan, to try to cover her until she can exfiltrate herself out of the United States. Go report it to the NYPD, and she does that too. She thinks she's going to get out of potential arrest and prosecution. Well, she didn't, because when she went to go report her stolen laptop was her idea. Reported as stolen. That's what her and Papa came up with. She was arrested by the FBI at the NYPD offices. This is the level, this is the detail of the incompetence. All of these illegals returned to Russia and were heralded as great spies. Really? Oh, they didn't penetrate the United States government. They didn't recruit any meaningful spies. What they did was spend a lot of money buying homes, living comfortably in the West. What did the SVR say about them? You're not in the US to live comfortable lives and raise your children. You're supposed to be producing intelligence. That's from their own center. Those are their exact words. So none of them were successful. Why weren't they successful? I believe to a degree it was their training. They were trained very poorly. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia's been trying to do it on the cheap. I think the greatest misunderstanding in the West with regards to Russian intelligence, we tend to equivocate and we tend to think that, with the example of the FSB, Federalная служба безопасности, the Russian internal service, you'll often hear in the West, even among academics, even among experts, they'll say it's the equivalent of the FBI, or it's the equivalent of MI5. Nothing's further from the truth. There's absolutely no equivalence whatsoever between the Russian FSB and our FBI or your MI5 here in the UK. The FSB is a vast monolith bureaucracy driven by corruption, driven by deep, deep layers of corruption, the likes of which we can't possibly understand in the West. For starters, they're much larger than any of our intelligence or law enforcement agencies. And their overriding mission, their number one goal in everything that they do, is protection of the regime and protection of the personage of Vladimir Putin, keeping him in power. So there's nothing that we can relate to that whatsoever. Somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 officers across Russia. And they're embedded with corporations, businesses that feed their corruption and feed their bureaucracy. This started heavily in the 90s when the intelligence services and all the Russian government were running out of funding after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they used extortion, they used coercion to embed themselves and their officers undercover, what the Russians call prikrytие. They approached businesses and they said, you're going to cooperate with the FSB or the Foreign Service, the SVR. What you have left in Russia now, 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, is a giant kleptocracy. There always was corruption in the time of the KGB, and the KGB was embedded into the corrupt system of the Soviet Union as much as anyone. But today, those intelligence services, they run Russia. They answer to no one. And so I think that's the greatest misunderstanding in the West, is we're constitutional democracies. And when we have a change of power and administration in the West, all of those leaders of various government agencies, they're replaced, they move on. Not so in Russia. As long as Putin's been in power, his siloviki, his strongmen, as the term is in Russian, they've been ruling Russia now with him for 26 years. They just sort of rotate positions, people like Alexander Bortnikov, the head of the FSB. He's not going anywhere. He's one of Putin's right-hand men from the old KGB days. And so they all get their gold palaces on the Black Sea. They all get their supercharged corruption for them and their families. They're well taken care of and they're completely beholden to them. So I think that's the biggest misunderstanding. We can't possibly comprehend the level of corruption, that the degree to which those security services run Russia today. There's no equivalence in the West whatsoever. Vladimir Putin, he was a Chekist. He proudly calls himself a Chekist. He still is. What is a Chekist? What does that mean? And what is Chekism? So this is a belief, this is mythology in Russia today, that the Chekists, the First Committee for the Defense of the Revolution under Dzerzhinsky, the Cheka, that they were the good guys. That even though the Red Terror after the revolution, Dzerzhinsky and his thugs were famous for killing hundreds of thousands of Russians and other nationalities of the Soviet Union. And that was outdone within the decades after that by the NKVD. Millions of people killed during Stalin's purges by the NKVD. That's all whitewashed. So Chekism is the belief that they were the good guys. They were the elite of society. And this is why you hear Vladimir Putin constantly mythologizing the KGB in Soviet times, saying, well, they were always the elite of the Soviet Union, meaning he himself and his buddy, fellow hardliner, siloviki. It's the way they justify their existence, and in a very Orwellian sense, they justify their corruption. Well, after all, we were the elite of society then, and we're the elite now. You can't turn on Russian TV today without seeing a drama, movies, TV series, soap operas. It's all about the FSB and the security services, how they're protecting Russia and they're doing such good for Russia. It's all lies. It's all a carefully cultivated myth in order to feed the structures that the organy vlast, as they call themselves, the organs of power. The very terms, by the way, are all set up. It's very autocratic. Where would we in the West ever get away with calling members of our cabinet in the United States or here in the UK the strong men? These are my strong men, and they control the organs of power. But in Russia, it's perfectly normal dialogue. It's sort of the way things are done. The mythology is cultivated from Putin's very origin story. He talks about how in the 60s he was reading books, spy books, by an author named Yulian Semyonov. And he talks about how he wanted to volunteer as a young man. He went to the KGB saying, I've been reading these books by Semyonov and a famous movie that was made, 17 Moments of Spring. And they turned him away because he was too young. Gleb Pavlovsky was a spin doctor in the Kremlin. He now lives in the West. In The Economist about a month ago, he pointed out what I've always known, believed, and knew from my work with Russian intelligence officers. That's all mythology. That's all. Pavlovsky worked in the Kremlin. He said they cultivated this idea of the Chekists, the KGB, and Putin in particular, as the ultimate public servants. They're out there defending Russia, great Russia, and defending our way of life. The one thing that I'll say, why is it mythology? When have the Russian intelligence services in modern history ever really defended Russia and ever really done good for their country? Look at all the major terrorist attacks. These were abject failures for Russia. Look at the Crocus City Hall attack most recently in 2024. We in the West, CIA and FBI, it's reported in the media, our government tried to warn Russia. We said ISIS-K is going to strike in Moscow. They were given direct warnings. They didn't listen, they disregarded them, they were attacked. What did they do afterwards? They blamed Ukraine and they blamed the United States. That's Russian intelligence. Don't defend your people. Hundreds of them died in the attack. So much for FSB and other Russian intelligence professionalism. The attackers got away initially. They were later captured. They accused Ukraine and the United States completely falsely. And then they deny the facts, which is that they were warned and they didn't act on it. That's just one of many failures. The Nordost siege, when they used chemical weapons to disable the Chechen hostages, if you remember, many years ago. Special teams from Alpha and Vempel from the FSB came in. More hostages died from the chemical agent they used in the theater. Over 100 died from that, more than died from the hostages. So I don't believe that they're really competent. I don't believe they're professional or they do a better job defending their people. Russia is one of the world's ultimate surveillance states, where they monitor their citizens with cameras at every intersection, even in small cities. For 20 years now, the FSB by law has access to every cell phone company, every internet service provider in Russia. Every Russian cell phone is a walking surveillance beacon that they use to track their citizens. China is no different, by the way, but we're focusing on Russia today. So while they live in a state like that, the irony is Russian intelligence officers deploy abroad, blissfully unaware that in democracies we're also evolving some of these same technologies. Now, we use them law-based with warrants and otherwise, but you see this in the Skripal attempted assassination. Those GRU officers, when they traveled from Heathrow Airport, they seemed completely unaware that there are cameras in the UK everywhere. And they traveled directly from the airport to Salisbury, got off the train, immediately started what we call casing the environment, walking around downtown, walking around Skripal's residence, picking out how they would do the attack. All blissfully unaware, not using disguises, not doing anything to change up their tradecraft whatsoever. Poor tradecraft, poor training, poor execution. Why do they do it that way? Well, they get away with it. For the most part, they escaped. Thank God that Skripal and his daughter survived. There's no accountability in Russia. They're not going to be held accountable. In fact, one of them was, I believe, later elected to parliament. The Litvinenko assassins, one definitely was elected to parliament in Russia. I think it was Lugovoy. They escaped the UK. They literally left a trail of polonium, incompetence, didn't carry out the mission very well. Sadly, Litvinenko died a horrible, horrible death. But again, in terms of our awareness in the West, where were we when that happened? I'm not blaming the UK because I don't think the US did any better, nor would we have done better if the attack happened in the United States in terms of awareness. We couldn't believe, we didn't want to believe, Russian intelligence would actually use a radioactive substance like polonium to kill a defector. Why? Why would they do that? They did it because they wanted the West and their defectors, potential defectors, to know it was us, we did it. That's why they used Novichok against Skripal, a state-produced toxin. No organized crime group could ever do that. That can only be produced by Russian intelligence. So they want it as a deterrent to their own officers to say, you're going to do this, you're going to die a miserable death. Those weren't the only examples. A pilot named Kuzmanov, he defected to Ukraine with his Russian helicopter. The Ukrainians tried to warn him, don't leave our country, we'll protect you. Kuzmanov said, I want to live in Spain, that was always my dream. Within months of him living in Spain, Russian intelligence killed him. And they didn't even really try to hide it. Medvedev made a famous statement on TV. They asked Medvedev about it, the former prime minister. He said, well, a dog gets a dog's death. Dog deserves a dog's death. Their tradecraft is poor. That's their weakness. They're not trained to deal with modern technical surveillance, and they've shown time and time again incompetence at dealing with it. And so that's how and why we'll keep catching them in the West. I've been asked before, how vulnerable is Putin as a dictator? The Maduro operation showed how hollow the Venezuelan regime really was. A few dozen Cubans guarding him, not even Venezuelans, it was Cubans, and the strength and the just unparalleled resources of the U.S. military were on display. And why doesn't this apply to Putin? Why? Listen, no analogy whatsoever between Venezuela and Russia, nor between Iran and Russia, by the way. Russia is a security state set up over the past 26 years with one single purpose, to keep Vladimir Putin and his Siloviki in power. There's been a lot of rumors lately about coups and potential coups. All of those Siloviki, those strongmen that surround Putin, those hardliners, these are KGB veterans he brought with him when he was deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. Then when he was head of the FSB himself, he brought all of these men, Patrushev, Ivanov, Sechin, who now heads Rosneft. They control not just the security organs. Like Rosneft, Sechin controls economic power too. But what are we talking about with the security state? People say, oh, but 2023, Prigozhin, look at how vulnerable Putin was. No, he really wasn't. Prigozhin knew that he had no chance of ever getting to Moscow and really overturning Putin, and he wasn't trying to. Prigozhin, as a former oligarch himself, somebody that was fiercely loyal to Putin, he was frustrated his troops were not getting the ammunition they needed at the front. His men were dying because they weren't getting bullets. So he took his 30,000 private army and he marched on Moscow. And Russian generals that he went through Rostov Oblast, that he had fought with in Ukraine, they didn't know what to do. They didn't have specific orders to shoot on him. It happened very quickly. Had Prigozhin gotten to Moscow, he would have come across crack units of Rosgvardia, numbering somewhere around 300,000 troops, fiercely loyal to Putin, whose entire existence, all their benefits, all their special pay, all their special palaces of their leaders in and around Moscow, all beholden to Putin. He would have come against the elite 30,000 strong FSO, the Federal Protective Service, that is led by people like Krasikov, a former FSB officer who became a bodyguard of Putin, went abroad in 2019 and killed on Putin's orders, killed a Chechen dissident. And then what happened in 2024? Krasikov was swapped out, and it was very hard for the Germans to do it, and they did it at the request of the United States and other allies because we had innocent civilians. But why did Putin, this is important when we talk about his vulnerability, that doesn't really exist. Why did Putin insist on that assassin, that former FSB officer, assassin, bodyguard of his, being swapped out in 2024? Why did he greet him on the tarmac of the airport and give him a bear hug? He wanted all of his loyal, inner circle of loyal, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of those inner troops to know, hey, if you kill for me, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to get you out. So that's the type of loyalty he engenders. He takes very good care of the security elite in his country. Unfortunately, I don't believe he's vulnerable at all. I don't believe there's any chance of a coup. I don't believe there's any chance of any opposition to Putin. The next successor will be handpicked by him, or will be from that inner circle of those ruling Siloviki, like Alexander Bortnikov, head of the FSB. I wish it was different, but that's the reality of the security intelligence state that Russia is today. So the case of the Bulgarians, those 6 Bulgarians that were arrested in the UK for sabotage, attempted carrying out targeting of Bellingcat and other, I think Christos was one of the targets, Bellingcat journalists. They had other targets identified in Europe. This is a classic example of the evolution of Russian intelligence tradecraft. So we have to go back a little bit and understand the pressure that the Russian intelligence services have been under because of the Ukraine war, and even prior to that. When the UK government finally decided to act because of the Salisbury attack, the attack against Sergei Skripal, former GRU officer who defected to the UK, he was part of the spy swap in 2010. As I mentioned in my book, one of the quiet understandings between CIA, MI6, and the Russians was, hey, we're not going to target those who we did in the swap. You know, those illegals in the United States, they had children that grew up in the United States. So part of the understanding was, hey, leave those kids alone. Let them go live their lives however they want to live them. And some of them went back and reacquired their Canadian citizenship. So we don't target them because we live by our word. Not so with the Russians. So the Russians tried to kill Sergei Skripal, and an innocent woman, Dawn Sturgis, died here in the UK. Well, the UK government, I don't believe they acted quickly enough, nor did the United States, by the way. We give the Russians too damn much benefit of the doubt. But finally, when we acted, we started kicking out their officers. Slowly started kicking out Russian intelligence officers. It wasn't a lot of them, but the real turning point was in 2022 with the invasion of Ukraine. Europe finally acted en masse, kicking out hundreds of Russian intelligence officers that were hiding and working in embassies. What this left the Russians was a real dearth of professional intelligence, what the Russians call shtabny officery, staff officers of the GRU and the SVR. Both of them work abroad. Both of them encompass at any given time half or more of any diplomatic presence of any Russian embassy is traditionally intelligence officers. But we started kicking out these officers in the West, Europe. So kudos, good job, we did this. So the Russians don't have the professional intelligence officers to carry out all the intelligence work they want to do, particularly with the Ukraine war. Because now, of course, Putin wants to punch back at the West. And I believe that he's given the directive to his intelligence services very clearly to escalate. Find ways to hit back at the West, any way that you need to. Be creative. You know, I always make the allusion with the Russian intelligence services, they're a like an organized crime group. All the three services are like giant organized crime families. They're always out to impress the boss. And this is how Putin is referred to in their systems. He's the chef in Russian, chef. He's the boss. And that's how they talked about Stalin, by the way. It's very telling that they're using terminology back from Stalin's time. Stalin was the boss, and everybody knew it. So I believe what's happening in the Russian intelligence services, in an effort to impress the boss, they're coming up with more and more reckless operations. That's how you get a group like these six Bulgarians that apparently looked like just a couple of essentially pimps with women willing to prostitute themselves, whatever they needed to do to target, surveil, and potentially compromise or kill targets that were given to them by Russian intelligence. When they were wrapped up, when they were arrested, you saw elements of traditional intelligence tradecraft. You saw all those SIM cards and cell phones that they had with them. But for the Russians, these are expendable in the sense that these assets they're using, these agents, they're not professional intelligence officers. So what do the Russians do? They deny that they know anything about them. Oh, these are Bulgarians. We don't know who they are. Or these teenagers that are being wrapped up from whatever country in Europe involved in sabotage. Oh, we don't know who they are. So they give them ostensibly deniability, even though it's very thin, veiled deniability. And for the Russians, it's potentially a cheap win. If they succeed, they've gotten away with an operation without really involving any of their professional staff officers, without risking any of them being arrested and having to swap them later, like they often do. And they could get a big intelligence win. So in this case, they were trying to target journalists and other targets in the West that are going after Russian intelligence and learning their methods and exposing them like Bellingcat does very well. So that's kind of a snapshot of not just what they were doing with the Bulgarian ring, but I think they're doing it more widely all across Europe right now. The Russians are trying to fill in that gap of not having professional intelligence officers to impress the boss, to hit back with creative, inventive operations, including assassinations, including blowing up an airliner in Lithuania, also a very sort of bungling operation using a mix of organized crime and GRU officers talking to organized crime figures. Thank God that our intelligence services have been ahead of it so far for the most part, but it represents a level of escalation heretofore never seen with our Russian intelligence nor their Soviet predecessors. It's very dangerous. So the greatest danger to the West from Russian intelligence, by far, I believe, is active measures, information warfare. They're very, very good at it. They've been practicing it for 100 years. The first larger awareness of this in the West came with the 2016 elections in the United States. But a lot of the lessons we should have learned have been lost from it. Russian active measures, what they call активные мероприятия, they also call them measures of support, мероприятия содействия. There's an entire directorate of the SVR, their foreign intelligence, thousands of people devoted towards information warfare. So in the 2016 election, what was their goal in the United States? It was not fundamentally for or against any one individual candidate. Much of the reporting that's been released based on the DNI report of the entire U.S. intelligence community, based on the Senate Select Committee report, Marco Rubio was senior member of that committee. He signed off on that. It was a nonpartisan, bipartisan report, both of them. The DNI report was the intelligence community findings. The Russians themselves didn't know who was going to win the election. They thought, at one point, they thought Trump was going to lose. They had no idea. What they fundamentally wanted to do, though, was undermine democracy itself. This is what they did with Brexit in the UK at the same exact time, by the way. They were attacking Brexit. They were attacking the legitimacy of the entire Brexit vote, whether anybody can go to the polls in the UK and fundamentally voice their vote. That's what the Russians are after. That's the much bigger target, the much bigger prey on their hierarchy of goals, what they're trying to accomplish as predators targeting the West. They're not after the small game. They're not trying to just influence this or that issue or candidate. Let me give evidence of what I'm talking about. Facebook itself found in their investigation, Russian social media trolling was arguing, consistently they did this, they would argue both sides of critical issues, emotional issues to the American people in 2016, and again in 2020, they're doing the same thing. They target abortion, they target LGBTQ issues, Black Lives Matter. It doesn't matter, the Russian intelligence agencies aren't concerned about where Russia will benefit on those issues. They just want Americans to fight with one another politically. And that's what they're doing in the UK, and that's what they're doing in Europe, and that's what they were just doing in Hungary, trying to influence the elections. They're targeting democracy. They're targeting, very cynically, the Russians don't believe there's any such thing as free and fair elections. They've never had them. So they want our youth, they want our public to believe, well, you can't trust the electoral systems. And then they apply traditional Russian maskirovka, denial and deception. What does that mean? Well, it was the Venezuelan voting machines in the US. You can't trust those. Venezuela infiltrated. Anybody but Russia. Throw out any mythology, any type of a throwaway villain, false flag, somebody that can be blamed except Russian intelligence. Get Americans arguing, debating, fighting about that. And they don't have to necessarily start that myth, but they'll feed on it, like the Venezuelan voting machines. Former Attorney General Barr said in the United States, and he was appointed by Trump in the first administration, Barr said, it's bullshit. There's no truth to it. Venezuelan voting machines didn't happen. It wasn't a part. They weren't compromised. No voting systems were compromised. And yet in my own country, we have a lot of Americans that don't believe they can trust voting machines. That's Russian intelligence. That's their information warfare acting on a democracy. And they're not the only ones. Chinese intelligence is doing it too. Finally, here's the critical threat. What they did in 2016, Russian intelligence officers and their proxies, organized crime, hacking groups, other cyber attack actors, social media meddling farms, troll farms like Yevgeny Prigozhin's Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. These were people, these were human beings given quotas a lot of times. They were told you have to do 200 social media posts today. That was one of the figures. What they did then with people, today with cognitive warfare, is amplified 10,000-fold by COG AI, by AI being able to do it. Russian intelligence, FSB Center 16, one of their cyber operations centers, they can write programs. Go attack this issue, go social media meddle in X today, to meddle in LinkedIn, meddle in, and COG AI can go do it for them. This is the greatest threat to our democracies. This is what we're not on top of. With anywhere between 20 and 40% of all content now AI generated on the internet, our adversaries are in overdrive. The Chinese and Russians both doing this to our democracies, trying to influence the populations. It's very dangerous. So we give the benefit of the doubt too often. These actions are carried out, the drone incursions into Poland and other countries. You know, when that happened in Poland last year, when I think 20 to 30 drones in one day, there was debate among NATO countries. Well, I don't know, maybe it was just an accident. I mean, Russians said it was just an accident. Why the hell do we give them the benefit of the doubt? This is a country carrying out the largest aggression, the largest land invasion since World War II. Why do they get the benefit of the doubt? But we do. We consistently give them the benefit of the doubt. So only when we have an all-encompassing, everybody on the same page, acting as one, the NATO alliance, calling out every single instance of Russian hybrid warfare, of all of their gray zone tactics, including information warfare that they're very, very good at. So this is a new evolution of hybrid warfare, non-contact, or what the Russians call new generation warfare. The military and the intelligence is all part of the same Russian way of war. It's not separate. They don't think of things separate the way we do in the West. They don't divide it up. It's all part of a non-ending, escalating second front against the West. Never-ending war is the way that some analysts describe it, and I believe that's accurate. That's the way the Russians think about unending conflict with the West, and that's what they're engaged in, and we need to be a lot more savvy about understanding it if we're going to counter it. So the question comes up often, you know, where's the state of Russian intelligence evolution now, and are they doing the things that they're doing in Europe, in the United States? I believe they are. I believe that they're casing. Casing is a term we use in intelligence when they're planning for it. They're preparing for the next war. I believe they're surveilling, and I talk about some in my book, they're constantly surveilling critical infrastructure. Look at what they're doing off the coast of the UK. How many incidents have taken place now? A detail in chapter 8 of my book. There's a Russian ship called Yantar. Yantar is an intelligence gathering ship. It's repeatedly been monitored off the coast of Ireland, off the Cornish sea coast. It's monitoring the cyber lines between the United States and the UK. Why is it doing that? Why is it carrying out those missions? In the event of war, they want to be able to cut those cable lines as quickly as possible. They have a special submarine. It's, I believe, an Oscar II submarine, outfitted by Guji, and I detail this in my book. Guji is a long Russian word, acronym stands for the Directorate for Undersea Water Research. It's part of Russian military intelligence together with their navy. And their job is to survey underwater cables and be prepared to cut them. They have a mini sub that links up with the other submarine. You can read about it, it's all on Wikipedia. This is all known, we know they're doing this. So this is the next evolution, being prepared to also satellite warfare in space, take out our reconnaissance satellites, use anti-satellite weapons, both the Russians and Chinese. So this is how all of their gray zone warfare, non-contact warfare, the idea that even though we're not shooting missiles at the UK or the United States, they're preparing for war in a way that we're not as democracies. So it's an incredible challenge. And it's something that I don't believe we have enough attention to. That's why I'm speaking out. That's the mission of my book. My strongest piece of advice for us as NATO allies is not to forget, first of all, that our alliance is the very envy of Russia and China both. We have an alliance that stood for 80 years. There is a special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom that no one can come between us, and nor should we allow them. All the bickering, all the sniping, both sides of the Atlantic, from the United States, some of our politicians, and some politicians in Europe. We're fed up with each other. Oh, Europe maybe needs to go its own way. This is nonsense, okay? We need each other now more than ever against the Russian threat, and the Chinese for that matter. The Chinese military as an adversary is much more competent, much more capable than the Russian military. The Russian military, in 4 years of war, they haven't been able to subdue Ukraine, thank God. The Chinese military is on the rise. They have more ships than the US Navy. I believe we're still more competent. But NATO is our strength. Those alliances are our strength. The Russians don't have anything like that. Look at how they abandoned Venezuela. They don't care about Maduro. They never did. Iran, the only reason they're using a limited alliance with Iran is to try to kill American troops if they can now in Iran. What about China? Is it a real strategic alliance? They call it a partnership without limits. It's nonsense. Last year was the first time ever, I believe, the Russians and Chinese did air defense exercises together. And we should take note, it's important. But the first time ever that they've done exercises like that, air defense exercises, we do that in NATO every single year. We've been doing it for 80 years. So let's not abandon an alliance. In the words of your king when he visited the United States, he said so wisely, this is an 80-year alliance. We've had ups and downs, we've had difficulties. The Suez crisis, by the way, very early in '53, was a major crisis for NATO. Everybody thought, oh, it's not going to survive. We will survive, we will endure. Five Eyes intelligence relationships are very important. We share intelligence every single day. The head of NATO just commented this week, thankfully. He said, hey, you know, the US has never stopped providing critical intelligence for the Ukraine war. He cited it, he said it publicly. And there were some in Europe who criticized him for saying, oh, why are you giving credit to the United States? Listen, we need each other in this fight more than ever. We need Ukraine as an ally. We should be giving them everything they need to finish the job. And there was a famous quote from Churchill, again, echoes of 1940. Give us the tools so we can finish the job. We need to give the Ukrainians the tools they need to end this war, to present enough damage, enough threat to Russia's critical infrastructure, not their people, not targeting civilians like they're doing in Ukraine, but their critical infrastructure, their energy assets, so that Russia finally realizes, you know what, time to end this war. So I think that that's our strength as an alliance. We can never turn away from each other. That's what the Russians are most scared of. That's why their information warfare always targets us as an alliance, tries to cause those gaps and feed into those gaps that might exist between us, but shouldn't. We live in a time, you know, I quote from World War II a lot. I'm a historian by my background, my training in college. It was my first major. I got a second major in Russian language. But I'm an historian fundamentally. I'm constantly studying history, and I believe we can't forget it. You know, Churchill warned about the choice between dishonor and war. That famous quote he said after Munich, you know, and he said there was a clear choice between dishonor and war. And he said, you know, that the UK and France for that matter, you know, chose dishonor and got war anyway. This is the period we live in. He also said, Churchill said, that time, just like this time now, is a time of consequence. Decisions have consequence. The time for prognostication and half measures is over. We've had nothing but half measures with Ukraine, a democracy fighting for its very existence. We've had half measures. We're not going to give them Abrams tanks. Okay, I guess we'll give them Abrams tanks a year or two later. We're not going to give them HIMARS. Okay, maybe we'll give them HIMARS. We're not going to give them Leopard tanks. Maybe we'll give them Leopard tanks or Challenger tanks. We're not going to give them F-16s. Oh, finally, after 2 years, we'll give them F-16s. All these half measures, prognostications, putting it all off. We're living in a time of consequence. This is when our alliance, this is when being united matters the most. The only way we're ever going to stop Russian aggression is if we stand united in the West. And we say, you know what, those $300 billion in assets seized, we're giving them to Ukraine, Russia. because your level of aggression, your escalation, your targeting of Ukrainian civilians intently, hitting maternity wards, targeting schools, thousands of children have died. That's too much for us in the West. We're going to say enough. But we haven't to date. We've tried those half measures. We tried equivocating. So when we speak to Putin in the same language that he's spoken to the West, when we make him understand there's costs for war, that's when this war ends, and that's how we prevent the next war. That's the most important thing, how we prevent the next war. My book, Tradecraft, Tactics and Dirty Tricks, Russian Intelligence and Putin's Secret War, is out with Naval Institute Press in April of this year. The book is all about the tactics used by Russian intelligence. All of it is an attempt to educate, inform, and counter the Russian intelligence malign influence and operations.